In part two of ICA's Renewable Energy podcast, Jose Briano from Carrera talks about renewable energy infrastructure in the grid, the distribution of energy generation, and how copper supports renewable technologies.
Jose, traditionally, people would get their power from the cities. The electricity would go from the city, from the grid that was in a developed location in a country and out to the country. Now, when you talk about wind farms and PV, it's more that the power is coming from somewhere in the country and then coming to the city. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of reversing the power grid?
Sure. The traditional structure of the electricity market is described as central, which means that there are very big generation facilities relatively close to where the demand is, and energy moves in one direction from generation to the final consumer through the transmission and the distribution grid. With the advent of renewable energy, particularly photovoltaics, what's happening is that energy is now also flowing in the opposite direction, meaning from the final consumer up. Why this happens is because if you have PV panel installed in your house, its peak generation is at a time where the family is not in the house and is therefore that energy is not being consumed. So it makes sense, depending on the regulatory framework of each country, to inject it back into the grid so it's consumed elsewhere. Now, this poses challenges to the structure and the management of the electric grid. Essentially, it means that there's a requirement for more monitoring, more control, and more elements which allow you to act upon the grid and determine what's injected when and where, which implies power electronics, meaning inverters, etc. Depending on the penetration of distributed energy sources, which is the name for these non-central energy sources, we will need to upgrade our distribution grids so they can absorb this excess capacity and this two-way flow. There's another challenge which is not to do with the reversibility of the grid, with to do with distributed energy generation in cities, in urban areas, which is the integration of large volume generation of variable sources which are in remote places. Very clear example of this is the offshore wind developments in Great Britain, particularly in the North Sea. So that's why it's been such a reference case in how to integrate energy sources such as wind and PV.
As you mentioned, there are a variety of energy sources in various regions, from remote villages to populated cities. How can this diverse system of energy sources run smoothly?
A way to push this forward, if we think, let's say, regionally, and taking the example of Europe, what will facilitate to integrate large volumes of renewable energy, which tend to be variable, particularly wind and PV, would be to have energy highways which connect the whole continent. So this energy highway would allow the excess generation of PV in, say, the Mediterranean to be exported to Northern Europe when there's demand, and for excess wind to be transported to the south when there is excess generation in the north. That way you balance the system and you make the most use of renewable energy. Suffice it to say that no matter how large the system is, and a European-wide system would be pretty large, it still requires a lot of monitoring and control technology, good control centers, and of course, good planning, which would allow the control centers to know exactly what's going on and be able to balance the system more effectively.
Jose, in your study, you wrote about copper intensities for specific technologies. Please explain how copper might be used in some of these renewable technologies.
Sure. Let's say copper in the traditional elements, electrical elements like transformers or in cables, which are in low voltage. And then there is copper in more advanced elements, which are usually related to power electronics, which allow to control, let's say, the wave which is generated by each renewable sources, and which also allows to, let's say, control how that wave behaves. Copper is also required in some of the transmission technologies we've mentioned, like HVDC, which means high voltage direct current. And it includes a lot of copper precisely because it's based on power electronics.
Okay, switching gears a little bit here. Recently, technology giants Google and Apple announced plans for 2 major renewable energy projects, demonstrating that solar and wind power are becoming good financial bets for energy-intensive corporations. Is this trend happening in Europe? And if so, where have you seen it?
Well, Nicole, in Europe, I have to say that investments as large as these in renewable energy by essentially private enterprises have not been so common. The reason for this is that traditionally the European renewable market was basically a financial investment. The reason for this is that the costs of renewable energy were higher than the actual costs of energy from the grid. So the government supported it. Now, this invited financial investors to basically develop generation sources as a way to make returns. And it did not invite large final consumers as much.
Here in the United States, we still talk a lot about renewable energies as future focused. When do you see people thinking of renewable energy more as now? Like, this is how we're going to get our energy moving forward. Do you see that happening anytime soon?
The way that the energy market is transforming, and it's a revolution, is that these technologies which allow final consumers to generate their own electricity are basically changing the rules. And it's not only a decision which needs to be taken by the large utilities. So at this micro level, renewable energies are extremely relevant already because we have, for example, grid parity in many areas of the world. If we move to wind, I think that there the requirement for the minimum investment is higher. It's a different type of energy, but it's also very competitive. I think the renewables are here to stay, and whether they become more or less attractive on a short-term basis is determined by factors which are to do with, for example, what's happening with the price of petrol.
This ends part 2 of our Renewables podcast segment with Jose Briano from Carrera, a global energy consulting firm in Spain. Please click forward to hear part 3 of the ICA's program on renewable energy.